not winning 90% of your new business because you have some sort of incredible value.
I'm going to take a bit of a different angle.
I've got a budget this big. I'm going to give it to you because you have a really killer plan.
You give a Red Bull to a turtle, what do you expect?
I think that's a dead turtle. So let's move on to...
E-break.
Cheers.
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 Does your current premium finance company lock you into long-term agreements? That's because they don't want you talking to us. At IFS, we win your business the good old-fashioned way, with customer service. I know you don't always have to use a premium finance company, but when you do, you should use IFS. Cheers.
Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Digital Insurance Pint Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Reed, and as always, I'm joined by my co-hosts, Steve Earle, CEO of Cheap Insurance.
Hello.
Adam Mitchell, CEO of Mitch Insurance.
Hello.
And Jeff Roy, CEO of Excalibur Insurance.
Welcome, Pinters.
So today we're going to talk about what is a on and off hot topic, broker independence. So that discussion's been around for quite some time. It was a very lively discussion back in the early 2000s. Died down for a little while, but it's popped up again. We all saw an article on LinkedIn talking about it. We thought we'd actually dig into it. So we're going to talk about the implications of broker independence or lack thereof on the broker channel in a number of different areas. And first, just want to point out that for the most part, my colleagues here are primarily independent. There are a few entanglements here and there, which I think is normal for every broker. But none of you guys secretly work for BrokerLink or McDougall, do you?
Well, that could be independent too. What's your definition, Tom?
I'm going to start off first. We have no loan. We have no loan from any insurance company at this point. I don't believe there's any ROFRs that I've signed because I haven't taken any loans. There could be some contract buried away from 9 years ago I didn't read, but I'm not aware of it. So I would think that Excalibur is independent, according to my definition.
Okay. Steve, what's your take on it, Steve?
Well, my situation is a little bit unique because I'm actually the principal at two separate brands, which are two separate companies, which have two separate sets of shareholders, which I think have different levels of independence. So to deal with Cheap, which was a startup 6 years ago, needed working capital. We looked around and we have an insurance company that's engaged with Cheap. They do have some shares. It's a minority by far, and there's finance arrangement there. You're not going to start. It's pretty hard to start a company, particularly in our space these days, with no money and no recurring revenue to begin with. But is that shop independent? I would say it is to a degree in that it places business with whom it wants. It creates its own business plan, and it carries on. The insurer that we're engaged with is actually the smallest one by volume, or in by far the minority. So that company is following its own path up to itself. Of course, there are ties. The other one, the traditional shop that I have at Bald, is it more independent because it doesn't have these hooks into it? It's still making decisions based on what's in the best interest of the consumer. It's still following its own business plan and doing what it wants, and can say this is what we want to do, and we're not following a path that's set up for us by anybody else, nor are we following direction.
Adam, do you consider yourself independent, and why?
Yeah, I think by every definition of independent, we'd be independent. Along this journey, we've taken loans from insurance companies and banks, and we've got a couple different insurance companies lending into it in a loaning capacity, but we don't have any insurance company ownership, so I have control.
Okay, so let me test so you all say you're independent. Let me test your hypothesis with two questions. And I think pretty much answered the first one already, and I look at it in the terms of our operations. Like, do you make, you may have a leadership team or other partners, but within your entity, without without having to go to an insurance company, do you get to make operational decisions, strategic decisions about running the business on your own? I think that question's essentially been answered. All of you are saying yes, right? So my second question is, Steve's closer to this aging out than well, maybe Jeff is too, but we'll see. But the other question is, like like really high level, could you sell to when and to whom you wanted to, with your own decision making? And let's say you've got a 2-year time horizon. So obviously there might be some short term encumbrances, bank loans, or what have you that you have to deal with. But let's cast forward 24 months down the road. Could you make the call to sell to a junior partner, to a private equity firm, to BrokerLink if you wanted to, 2 years down the road?
Yeah.
Okay. So to me, if you can run your business, you can get rid of your business, you're independent.
I like the other litmus test. It came from Matt at CAA saying, do you have the ability to decide to cancel all of the brokers on your panel, all of the markets on your panel?
Yeah, and I would suggest maybe not all of them. I think you meant any of them.
Right. Like, do you have contractual ability rights to cancel and walk away?
I do, for both shops. Would people be mad? Yeah, probably, but I could do it. There's nothing that stipulates that that it has to be any other way.
Yeah, operate your day-to-day business. And the second one was, could you sell 2-3 years down the road, should you so desire?
Yes, I could sell 2 or 3 years down the road to whom I desire. I would add a caveat to that with cheap, because it's different. I could still get an offer from whoever I wanted, but the outcome might be different. And then you have to look for any other brokers that are listening. These sort of contracts, could I sell it to my employees? Could I sell it to my kid? Could I sell it to? Yes, I have made sure that it's protected certain individuals, certain groups of individuals, all that sort of thing.
Okay. Cool. Jeff?
Yeah, simple yes and yes to both of those.
Okay, good. So I think, my take on it is, with that sort of fairly simplistic view on independence, I mean, it's simplistic in terms of asking the question. It is powerful in terms of what it allows you to do. You guys all meet that test. So
I think, Tom, that we're always talking about insurers. I think that the bank is probably more interested in my business plan than any insurer, for the most part, if you're dealing with the bank, right?
Are they, or just the bottom line?
Yeah, well, they want to see that the bottom line's going in the right direction. But I mean, we're trying to lock down the spectrum, and you go back to before Jeff starts. You've got this like George Cook version of independence. Then you've got like sort of the Louis Gagnon version of independence. You've got the Matt Turek version. Can you cancel anybody else? So I don't know. It depends on how you look at it. The definitions are not what they were 20 years ago. You're either, it's not black or white.
One thing in there quick. I want to add one thing in there too. The one thing is, if you are company owned, the TAC or the take all comers market puts an interesting spin, because you have an obligation to offer certain markets, and you can't game and direct business to certain ones over another. Your hands are tied in Ontario, so it's more difficult for those markets to move things around than it was in the past, which, obviously to their testament, maybe gives them a better case in some carrier areas, or makes them have to choose to part with the market if that becomes an obstacle, right? So just something I want to bring on, how the take all comers market kind of over blends onto this.
I think that's a great segue to our first conversation point, which is client advocacy, right? So, whether it's take all comers, in some provinces versus other provinces, whether that's, that's auto, if you're talking commercial or property, if you kind of mix that all together, do you guys think that a independent broker, someone who's, I think we just defined it as a bit of a spectrum, if we look at someone who's towards the George Cook end of the spectrum versus someone who's towards the Louis Gagnon end of the spectrum of independence, do they do a different and or better or worse job when it comes to client advocacy, depending on which end of the spectrum you're on? And Steve, I'll pick on you first.
I don't know. It probably comes down to the individual, but I think that if you can say who's calling the shots over there and for who. So is that organization or is that management team or principal or that brand, is it representing its customers or is it representing an insurer or two first? So it was always my pet peeve when I heard some of the old guys saying, we represent ABC Insurance Company. It's like, no. You need to represent, if you're a broker, you truly represent your customer in the insurance marketplace. You're not their representative.
I mean, part of this is going to be negated, I think, if you're, I'll speak for Rebo, which I know better than maybe in some of Steve's jurisdictions, but if you're going to sign off that you're, brokering well in the best interest and intent of the client, then like the ownership of your cap table, if you are authentically actually fulfilling the duties of a good broker, shouldn't matter. Like your shareholders may want you to act and behave a certain way, but whether it be take all comers or fair treatment of clients or any other pieces would hold us to a certain standard of the Insurance Act of what's allowed and what isn't, regardless of what a shareholder wants for returns.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is if you're doing a good job as a broker, who owns you, in theory, should be irrelevant.
Beyond disclosure of like, hey, here's fair conflict of interest, but an upstanding broker, if you've upheld your duties, like I would think it doesn't matter.
Well, I can tell you, so between 2007 and 2010, I was the COO at BrokerLink, and that was when some of these disclosure rules came in place. And, we had to disclose on our website and, a variety of other places that BrokerLink was a wholly owned sub of Intact Financial Corp. And there's no attempt to hide that. It was hey, that's the rule, no problem. The job is to represent clients, right? So I am comfortable that that disclosure is out there. Now, whether clients see that or pick up on it and understand the implications is a whole different question. Or care, right? Well, care is probably even the more important question. But if you leave that one aside, I am quite confident that any broker that has the appropriate level of ownership by some insurance company is absolutely disclosing that.
I think the tire meets exactly what you said. The tire hits a pavement. All these brokerages are going to want to provide the best service for their client, and they're going to advocate for them when needed, regardless if you're owned or not. Because at the end of the day, you're one Google review or one bad press release away from having the brand damage. So nobody's going to allow that to happen. I would argue that some of these other carriers have challenges right now because companies like CA have said, hey, if you're owned by a company, we're not doing business with you. So some of them don't have quite the same selection as some of the other brokers that aren't owned by a company do have. So it puts them in a little bit of a disadvantage right now in the short term. But that said, I think everybody tries to do the best job. I don't think, depending on which spectrum you're on, you're still going to advocate for the client.
That's worth unpacking. Like, does everybody? Like, do you think there are places and operations that don't have as clean of a cap table or piece? Like, do you think there's people acting not in the client's best interest because of a cap table?
Well, I think it was last week or the week before we talked about being super efficient with only 3 markets. Well, what if I went with only 3 markets because I didn't really have much of a say in it? I concentrated my volume with 3 markets for efficiency. Is that in all of my customers' best interest when I just pick 3? Or I'm made to pick 3 or 2? Who am I acting on behalf of here?
Does it matter whether you're made to or choose to? I mean, the impact on the customer is still the same.
It's a good question.
Good question.
Historically, there's a broker in Ontario, I won't mention any names. They rolled a bunch of books for a couple years, got the overrides, then sold to a bigger broker to get all those markets back. So that was their exit strategy. Was that in the best interest of the consumer? No, it was in the best interest of them. There's now rules and some regs in place to prevent that kind of behavior from acting. So I think in the past, when there was a more of a wild, wild west and open thing, people did do stuff, hence why we got regulation right now.
And
right?
you're right. I mean, if we talk overrides, have historically been paid to brokers, whether they're so-called independent or not so much. And you're moving a book of business. You are not looking at every client, right? As a broker, you're saying, right, I am agreeing, I'm canceling market X and moving to market Y, or taking a chunk of business from market X to move it to market Y, and in exchange, I'm getting paid for that, right? I mean, you could argue that those overrides probably are not necessarily in the best interest of your client, unless you're doing it because market X has, they've lost all their good claims people, they're doing something strange on the pricing side, that you're moving it because that market has gone to, to hell in a handbasket. But I've seen overrides that are done because it's, in the financial best interest of the broker.
It's backfired a bit because companies have put in retention clauses into the bonuses they pay in the CPC because of retention, because of people moving books like that. But now it protects bad underwriting when the underwriter's not doing the job. So it's created another double-edged sword, right?
Yeah, I guess my point is, we're talking about client advocacy in the context of independence or lack thereof. And, we've all seen brokers move books of business, whether they're independent or dependent, for overrides, right? So it doesn't seem to, whether it's a dependent or independent broker, that's not really the driving force.
Okay, so we've seen associations, clusters, and independent, like individual brokers, I should say, scream from the top of mountains, "Hey, we're independent. We're fiercely independent." And they must be speaking to one of four audiences. Either insurance companies, and we can talk through if that matters at all. They're on social media speaking to potential clients, of which I'd say, what are you actually saying? What's the difference? Are you saying others are going to do good, bad, other? Current teammates or future teammates, or their own ego, right? But is there anyone else they could possibly be thinking they're talking to when they yell this?
It goes back to, does the consumer really care, Adam? Do they? And I would argue, though, that in that the commercial customer is usually a bit more astute when it comes to that sort of thing.
So what's the commercial customer worried about?
Dealing with yet another company. I got an invoice from this company 2 years ago. I got an invoice from this one. I got an invoice. Now I've got an invoice from this one. I didn't change anything. I didn't change my broker, but yet I've dealt with 3 over the last 4 years.
Because the broker kept getting bought, sort of thing?
Does that matter to the customer, whether it's personal lines or commercial lines?
But I think the important part on that conversation, or to your client on either, is, hey, tell me that you're not going to sell this thing in 1, 3, 5, 10 years so that I can be stable and know who I'm talking to, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would add the fifth one, Adam, to your list is other brokers. You mentioned companies, potential clients, teammates, your ego, but other brokers, because you see the value propositions when we were pitched, everybody a different angle. And I think it was Bruce from Acera, now it was from Rogers at the time, that mentions that they're the only one owned by independent venture capital money with a minority stake. And his play on that was, by being owned by them, decisions are made in Canada, not in another country, and they're not going to get bought and sold like some of these other entities where venture capital is in there, they cash out, we don't know who's bought them next. Now, there's a perception that being owned by a Canadian company is better or worse. That's another up for debate. It depends on people's personal preference. Does the consumer really care? As long as you got markets and you're competitive and doing your job, I don't know if they really care to go down the rabbit hole of ownership until there's a problem, right? I don't think anybody's ever going to do that. You mentioned the staff care because, some people don't want to be part of a big monolithic 2,000 person entity where their employee number 1,999. Others like the opportunity to do that and have employee stock ownership, right? So there's a bunch of different plays, but I think your list is good. I would just add brokers as number 5 onto that list.
So here's a question. Back to the money piece. Are you independent enough to say, I could have a 5% EBITDA and I'm the only one who gives a shit about it. Nobody will question me on it, right? So there's like 50 shades of independence here. Is it independence from big money? Is it independence from like what?
If we role play, Steve, and say, okay, you're independent, and I'm the big bad not independent. I have ownership via 4 insurance companies and 2 private equities, right? Like just a clustering of all the worst. So what?
Does it matter to the
I got a
consumer?
board of directors I have to answer to. That's going to keep some sort of stable ship on something who's been successful in that. And you can go bipolar and go left, right, and center and things. So like in my version of the debate club, I'm more stable and going to be straight and narrow and a responsible operating thing.
So let's turn our attention to staff, because we started to pick away at that one here. So our second category of conversation is, does your positioning on the spectrum of independence help you attract staff, / retain staff, or not?
I don't think it's a spectrum, Tom. There's no more spectrum from left to right on independence. It's like a freaking Venn diagram now. Seriously, like it's not linear any longer.
Okay, so let me rephrase that. So depending on where you sit on the hypercube of broker independence, does that help attract and or retain staff?
I mean, I'd argue, so it's a minority of all conversations ever, I think. I don't think like 98% of any teammates or prospects are going through this. Of that one, so if I'm talking to that person who has it, it's like, well, actually, there's a business case to be said that if it is owned by an insurance company who is trying to secure their distribution, even of a minority angle, you're like, well, that's now a cemented path. It's not going somewhere else. Insurance companies don't trade brokers, not often.
Okay. Steve, Jeff, guys, like, you're on the one end of the hypercube. Are you finding it, relatively speaking, easier to retain / attract staff because of that? Not because of your location or anything else, but because people come and say, hey, I like the fact that Jeff's the owner I know who's run the shop, therefore I want to go work there. And Jeff, do you find that?
Not sure. I'm not the one to be able to say that that's definitively, like I think it comes down, do you want to be part of a smaller team or bigger team? I think maybe size has more of it. Some people, there's pros and cons of it, right? So I wouldn't say it comes down to ownership versus company versus not. I don't think that really necessarily factors in as much as people think, but
I think that there's certain just like there's certain types of customers, there's certain types of team members that thrive in particular types of environments. When some people don't want to work for a company that has 2,000 employees in there, just a number, and these sort of things. There's pros and cons to working for a big company or a small company, and those pros and cons weigh differently on different types of people, depending upon where they live, who they are, what their experience is, and so on.
I'll agree and pile on. I said the red herring here is the ownership cap table. Like the difference is size of company, culture, values, like those are all true. There's an upside to a big company as there's all kinds of layers you can get promoted and escalate within. Downside, you're probably going to have a pretty narrow channel and job description and responsibilities for any of the different bandings and bars. You go to a small company, you can probably get a wide swath of responsibilities and things you can take on and walk into the principal's office and have a discussion. Like those are different, but unrelated to cap table in my mind.
Okay. So far we've talked about client advocacy, and I think we've kind of concluded it doesn't matter. Staff attraction / retention. It's not directly tied to the independence. It's tied, as Adam just said, more to the culture and size and opportunity and so on. So again, sort of a strikeout from an independence perspective. Let's move on to carrier relationships, right? And I'll preface this one by saying, going back to when I was at BrokerLink, that was a time when this was a big deal in the industry, and BrokerLink at the time was very focused on its relationship with Intact, right? And my relationships with other carriers were exceedingly difficult at the time. I think that has changed quite dramatically.
And then the main thing we're under now is, should it matter? Should we advise or think it matters for carriers?
Yeah. Well, so if you are a independent broker, are your relationships with carriers better or worse or the same than if you're a owned or partially owned brokerage?
I bet you again it matters more based on scale and operation than it does on the ownership. I think there is some ownership slights in that, like, you can't make it to the top tier clubs to a number of the brokers without either having ownership, or you're barred because you have ownership from competitors, right? So that's a material difference in the relationship based on a cap table. But the most part, the quality of representation and time you get with a company is probably going to be based on how much volume do you support them with and the profitability of that.
Yeah, I agree with Adam 100%. Growth, scale, profitability. What's your sales velocity? Are you growing with them? Are you profitable? That seems to have shifted. And again, the biggest advantage or disadvantage is the bigger people. So if you've got billions of dollars in premium and you've got 400 or 500 million with a carrier, your relationship's a lot different than if you're a $30 million brokerage, right? And that's the way it's Pareto's principle. You're ranked. That's the way most companies have segmented it, right? More so than independence versus not. The only thing, as I said earlier, is if you're company owned, right now, currently CA will not give you a contract. In the past, I know Travelers, I think with George Cook took a hard stance, but then reversed it. And I think a lot of people, the early stance about, hey, if you're bought by this, we're getting rid of you, that has largely gone away. And some of these people that, some of the other markets, their biggest carriers are sometimes owned by companies now. So they've been able to learn to play ball in there.
Well, let me just elaborate on the Dominion at the time, George Cook, because I was in the rooms for some of these conversations. Dominion was a $800 to $1 billion premium insurance company at the time, and they were so focused on broker independence, they made the decision to cancel a slew of brokers that added up to about 100 million of their own premium. Right, so they took a very hard, fairly dramatic stance. It's like 08, 09, something like that, and probably chopped 10% of their business off the books because of the broker independence thing. Right, that's clearly changed. Right, there are a number of carriers that do business with whether it's BrokerLink or one of the other sort of obvious candidates, and manage a relationship.
I was in the room for some of those discussions with George too, and I could still remember his point was, I don't want to invest a great deal in a relationship when I know that eventually that business will be taken away. So why would I continue to invest in that relationship? It could be next year, it could be 3 or 4 years from now or whatever, but eventually that book of business, I will lose it. So we're just going to cut ties now. That was his stance at the time, right?
Yeah, and I would say so far, 15 years later, that's proven to be wrong. Right, those markets that, I'll just pick on BrokerLink because that's the one I know. Those markets, Economical was one of the first markets to sort of come back into a relationship with BrokerLink, and they did extremely well from that. And 15 years on, it's still going.
So other than a couple of outliers, insurers don't really seem to care either.
Yeah. So okay, we're strike out on client advocacy, strike out on staff, strike out on care relationships. Let's move on to our next one: business perpetuation, succession. And you guys have, I'm not sure if Adam's thinking about that yet, but I know Jeff and Steve, with your advanced ages, you probably, whether you've made plans or you've probably been thinking about it. Do you feel that you're in a better situation than somebody who's on the other side of the hypercube in terms of perpetuating your business?
Well, I would say that the fact that we can even think about it says something. Otherwise, if we were totally at somewhere else on the chart there, like completely not independent, we wouldn't think about it, because what's there to think about? It's already set.
Yeah, it's already part of the shares of Intact or Definity or whoever, right?
It's already written down. This is what will happen, and it could even be, and this is when, or this is what happens if this. So I don't know. The fact that you can even think about having a timeline and what you want to do, that could be a marker of independence. I don't know.
I think the big thing is, like I said, us being an older guy, not quite old as dirt, because I'm the second oldest guy in the podcast, not the oldest. But
it'll be me for the record.
Yeah, I'm not going to mention names. I am second oldest, but
I'm third. So
yeah, there you go. And Adam's a young guy in the spring chicken. But I think the big thing is autonomy. Like, again, if somebody was in that position, it's good as a business person, you create a business, basically at some point to get rid of it, right? Yeah, business either goes bankrupt or gets sold. There's only two things a business can do, right? If you're independent, you have a choice of where things go. And if you're company owned, it's pretty obvious that if you have a portion, guess who has the first right of refusal, right? So you have absolutely no choice. And you may have made a decision that seemed good 5 years ago that you're down that path, you can't get out of it. Whereas if you're 100% independent, you have the flexibility that you can be fluid, you have choice, right? So I think that's good as independent business owners and entrepreneurs. People like choice.
Okay, awesome. Adam, what's your take?
The thing that can get tangled in this is as some of these businesses and brokerages are succeeding or buying their way into the too big to succeed, then you're kind of painted into a corner of like, well, now there is only a dozen buyers in Canada that can transact this.
Yeah, not that many people can buy $1 billion brokerage.
Even 100 million.
That just gave me a great point there. Like, so even if it was a family member or kids coming up through, with the size and the valuation now, you might have a broker that's independent today, but could the next generation do it independently? That, I think, has closed. The ability for the next generation to do it entirely independent.
I was thinking of this today. So we saw just across the wire the McFarland Rollins bought by Definity. Looks like a massive valuation comes public, and I like McFarland Rollins and Burke and that team. I think they did a good job. So congrats to buyer and seller. But when you think of the ecosystem of how long will it take startups to amass a $250 million brokerage? So if these transactions, and within the last year, you saw McDougall's and McFarland's go, it's like, you know how long it's going to take a feeder system of startups with exactly the headwinds you're talking about, Steve, of like, it's kind of impossible now. They can't get markets. You can't get market share. You can't get airtime onto SEO. SEM's unaffordable. Like, we're watching like a one-way train in this consolidation where although there's startup numbers, I don't think the volume will catch up.
So what like you're saying is like farming. It's almost unattainable to get into it. It's very difficult. Is that what you're saying? Like land's got so high at $35,000 an acre, your cost of capital to get in. And again, yeah, it's funny in the States, the startups seem to do well and there's a big insurgencies of them. So I'm not sure if it's gone through more of a cycle or with 37,000 agents that, most of them are using some kind of person when you start up though, that's got the companies and volumes to get them off the ground. Right. So that's kind of where you got the rebirth. And there's some people in Canada doing that, like the Billiards of the world that are rebirthed it, where you kind of can be a startup again, right? So kind of bringing it full circle. So it's kind of a virtual loop at that point. So it's quite interesting. But as I said, I think the independence is independence, right? Like I think you're starting to flush out, Tom, is independent really that much different, right?
Well, it's the question we're trying to answer is how important. In a sense, how important is it? I mean, first talk about what is it, and then it's it's a little bit mushy, or it's a hypercube, and now we're kind of getting to. So I went through client advocacy. We felt it didn't matter. Staff attraction, retention didn't really matter. There's there's so many other things it drowns that out. Carrier relationships, in 2023, it doesn't seem to matter. Business perpetuation, we're saying okay, so it matters to this generation, but the next generation may have no choice but to take on a partner of some sort to get into the business. So maybe that the next generation, the business perpetuation question becomes a non-starter or a non-point as well. So the last one that I wanted to, which kind of brings us to the last point I want to talk about, is financial returns. And I'm talking about for the shareholders, which may be your cap table, plus you, Adam, or in Steve's case entirely him, in Jeff's case entirely him. So I'm talking about the shareholders in general. Do the financial returns, are they dependent? Are they enhanced, degraded, the same, whether you are independent or, somewhere further down the spectrum? Sorry, hypercube.
So it's like a video game. There's certain stages of a brokerage where you can get to profitability. So if you're bigger size, you can get a lot better EBITDA, right? Like, I think we all agree there's certain cost to operate a brokerage that you can't really jettison at a certain size. You're still stuck with them. Once you get to scale, you've already got those costs. That's when you really magnify it. So obviously profitability now, whether it's company ownership or independence or not, it comes down to scale. The people with more scale tend to get a better return once you get to a certain area, unless, I will preface this, you got a really good niche. You're awesome at your niche. You've nailed a niche that nobody else has got. Then you can compete. And that's what, Reagan Associates mentioned that, hey, if you want to compete, niching is one of your strategies to do it, right?
I agree with you, Jeff, that I think if you take a 10-person shop and a 50-person shop and a 100-person shop, regardless of whether an insurance company has a loan with them or owns a piece of them or owns all of them, the returns are probably, if they're very similar in nature, are probably going to be similar as well. I don't think that the presence or lack thereof of independence has a huge bearing on the bottom line.
So let me kind of wrap this up with one more question here. So we've gone through our list: client advocacy, X; staff attraction, X; carrier relationships, X; business perpetuation, sort of maybe; financial returns seems to be more about scale than about who is on your cap table. So earlier in the episode, we essentially declared each of you guys to be independent, whatever that means. So why do you remain independent? That's my question. Why are you staying the course, assuming you are, of where you are? Why have you not partnered up with some of the larger firms that become a cog in their particular set of gears?
I think that if and when it makes sense to do so, it's not off the table. I want to do what's in the best interest of our customers, our employees, and the business itself as its own entity. And you can't just, if you're going to stand on that mountain that Adam talks about and scream and not look at what's in the best interest of those stakeholders, including customers, and your staff and the shareholders, then yeah, you can't do that.
Okay, so from your perspective, it's simply a matter of timing, and opportunity, probably.
Yeah, I mean, it could stay the same until well beyond I pass away by whoever else is sitting in my chair, or it could be drastically different. It's going to depend. I mean, market conditions and what we can do and accomplish with what we have in front of us, that could change too. You might need to adapt. I mean, businesses need to adapt with a changing environment. It may require that at some point, right?
Yeah, Steve said that succinctly, said it perfectly. Like, it depends on how you feel. Like, one of the things, the test, I think, and the one thing we brought up earlier is, if you're independent, you have the choice of when you do that. And sometimes people, if they aren't independent, don't have a choice. They have a gun to their head. They're not flexible. It's a beautiful thing to live life on your own terms, to do that. Now, that said, there comes a point where you have a doubt day, where you have more good days than bad days, or Sunday night before you get into work, you start thinking about it in a negative way. There's certain things that happen in people's lives or things have changed in people's life. They've lost the passion. That's when a motivational thing will happen. And hopefully people have done something before it gets to that stage, because, if you ever get to that level, if you're looking at making a change with your brokerage, as my CEO from Vistage says to all the people in our group, selling your business is a full-time job.
Adam, last word over to you.
For me, Tom, what do you sell something that's going to double every 2.5, 3 years? Like, for about a decade, we've had 30% plus growth. And so on the macro of hey, why isn't it time to divest anything? It's well, because I'm going to have to then take that money and put it into a marketplace and beg for 4 points of return. There's just you don't sell this thing unless you really want it to de-risk and look for some others. So there's one. So two, if we did go down that road, you can only really go down the road once. So if you're going to go down the road once and you give an insurer or somebody an ownership stake, they're probably not going to want to let go of it. So a line from a friend, Dwayne Cridland, who built a nice operation up in the north of Ontario, he said, in the end of the day, as long as you have two capable parties fighting over you, you're going to be just fine. saying you want some sort of bidding opportunity of mutual interested parties to get max value. So again, for us, because we've never, for the position A, gone at time to divest and take a bit, there was never a process run on bringing suitors to the table to make sure whatever we did start down the road, there was a maximum execution. And so then the last one of I like the optionality of the future. And I'm pretty young and my kids are pretty young and our team's pretty young. And I don't really know who's going to want to take this on next or what brokering in our industry looks like in the next 10 years or so. But to Jeff's point is the only way we were going to have that option is one, not have executed with a strategic partner to cement a future. And two, get to the big enough size to stay off of the chopping block of markets and be big enough to matter for them. So that's our sort of diary of reasons as to why nothing's happened. It's not to say a never, as I'm a pretty big believer that this is all going to consolidate down to 5-10 hands. And we're already seeing overlap between markets and private equity and all kinds of things.
I think Jeff said it best earlier, is that there's two end states for a business. You sold or you go out of business. Right? The question is, when does that happen? In the meantime, trying to ride that rocket ship and keep all your doors open.
I think a good one, I heard it from Ed Myring, who Adam knows quite well. I think Tom, Steve, you know him quite well. He always said he looked at a brokerage as an equity, and he looked at the team and what they're doing. And he always said, would I invest my money in this team to grow and get the return every year? I think you have to look at your team that way, right? As your team, can you continue to outperform the market and do well? Or is your team peaked?
And I think you got to keep questioning that road ahead of what does the road ahead look like? Is it troubled waters and you should be considering some options, or is it smooth sailing? And it's going to be different based on teams and geographics and any number of market conditions.
Just wanted to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, IFS Premium Finance. Thank you very much. And to our charity partner, the Excalibur Read to Ride program.
Is retention important to your brokerage? Of course it is. That's why at IFS, we have a cancellation prevention process. Want more details? Give us a call. I know you don't always use a premium finance company, but when you do, you should use IFS. Cheers.